Hello? Jim, how are you? Oh, fine. General, I just wanted to bring you up to date on this matter because I know you're concerned about it. We got Friday night got a message from Khrushchev, which said that he would withdraw these missiles and technicians and so on, providing we did not plan to invade Cuba. We then got a message, a public one, the next morning, in which he said he would do that if we withdrew our missiles from Turkey. We then, as you know, issued a statement that we couldn't get into that deal. So we then got this message this morning. So we now have to wait to see how it unfolds. There's a good deal of complexities to it. If the withdrawal of these missiles, technicians, and the cessation of subversive activity by them, well, we just have to set up satisfactory procedures to determine whether these actions will be carried out. So I would think that if we can do that, we'll be find our interest advanced, even though maybe only one more chapter in a rather long story as far as Cuba is concerned. No, except that we're not going to invade Cuba. That's the only one we've got now. But we don't plan to invade Cuba under these conditions anyway. So if we can get them out, we're better off by far.
I just wondered whether you were trying to, knowing we could keep our word, whether you were trying to make them to that kind of statement or commitment to finding what they could be very, suppose they got it, suppose they started with fire.
Right.
What I'm getting at, I might believe this a very military move.
Right. Oh, well, I agree. Oh, yeah, that's right. I think what we've got to do is keep, that's why I don't think the Cuban story can be over yet. I think we've already retained sufficient freedom to protect our interests. If they engage in subversion, if they attempt to do any aggressive acts and so on, then all bets are off. In addition, my guess is that by the end of next month, we're going to be toe-to-toe in Berlin anyway. So that I think this is important for the time being because it requires quite a step down really for Khrushchev. On the other hand, I think that as we all know, they just probe and their word's unreliable, so we just have to stay busy on it.
We got to expect, not get to expect. That's how it's going to be. And so, what do this first stuff? So they get to they probe when they can, when they have another place where they think that they just won't for some reason. Why does they go ahead?
That's right.
Right. I guess that doesn't so that you won't be the exception. You've always got the right to serve and let the other guys that they serve.
Well, we'll stay right at it and I'll keep in touch with you, General.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so there you see John F. Kennedy talking with the previous president, Dwight Eisenhower of the United States, and Dwight Eisenhower expressing a view of the communists, which views them as a monolithic, dangerous threat. That he says, for example, he brought up how, for example, the communists took Tibet right after the Chinese Revolution in 1950, 1951. But he doesn't say the Chinese communists, he says all communists. In other words, that wasn't Mao Zedong and the Chinese, that was the world communist movement directed from Moscow, Russia, Soviet Union, that took Tibet. And of course, this is in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is 11, 12 years after the Chinese moved into Tibet. But Dwight Eisenhower views the world communist movement as a world's monolithic entity directed from Moscow to conquer and dominate the world. Tibet, Korea, Vietnam, now Cuba, right? And so I wanted to show how to look at that from that perspective of how these different actors are viewing the world, and in ways that we explain in this class. But of course, people at the time, they're not taking U.S. foreign policy class with us, and they are not talking about stereotyping and worldviews and assumptions. But we are talking about worldviews and assumptions. So Dwight Eisenhower, the way he's portraying the communist danger and threat is portraying, assuming a world that views the Soviet Union in terms of this enemy, diabolical enemy image, right? That there's a world monolithic communist movement led by the Soviet Union, which Ronald Reagan 35 years later would call the evil empire, that in 1983, so 30 years later, 31 years later, the evil empire. John F. Kennedy, when you look at his, sometimes you hear his statements where he talks in terms about also the communists seeking to expand, but when he actually makes deals and makes decisions, he sees a more complex Soviet Union, a more complex policymaking process within the foreign policymaking process of the Soviet government, that there's politics there, that there's constraints by public opinion, that Khrushchev is limited in what he can and cannot do, that Khrushchev has to keep people happy within the Soviet Union and within Moscow in order to keep his job, that there are issues of national pride, national humiliation, vested interest. All of these terms are complexity. Understanding the Soviet Union and Soviet behavior as due to a complex foreign policymaking process. So John F. Kennedy, I would say I would put him more here. John F. Kennedy sees more complexity in the Soviet Union in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis than Eisenhower did, which would be here. And I think also along this continuum of complexity versus stereotypical enemy image, you would also put his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson would be here as well, right? And the reason I mention this is because Lyndon Johnson would become president when Kennedy is murdered 2 years later. 1 year later, sorry, 1 year later, 13 months later when he's killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. So remember, let me again open up that file regarding the elements of the enemy stereotype. And so make sure you can see that. And so the elements of the enemy stereotype are here, right? We talked about the enemy stereotype. When you see a diabolical enemy, its motivation is evil, to conquer the world, like Mordor in Lord of the Rings. Decisional locus, monolithic, that Khrushchev or Stalin, they give their wish becomes foreign policy implemented by a slave empire. Highly rational, that they're always probing, challenging. They're always trying to see where you can expand and where you're weak, where your will is lacking, right? This is all part of a conspiratorial plan for world domination, all right? And Eisenhower sees that China moved in Tibet because Moscow wanted them to move in Tibet, not because the Chinese are nationalists and they view Tibet as part of their national patrimony that the British were attempting to split off from them as part of the British Empire. And their capability is derived from the fact that, we are a complex and messy democracy. We're a democracy, they're not. So we respect human rights and have elections, and everybody has the right to express their opinion, and we have public opinion, we have elections, we have newspapers with editorials, but Stalin doesn't have to deal with that, right? And those patriots who don't understand the dire nature of the threat, they're fools. Fellow Americans who don't understand this picture, they're fools. Or worse, they're spies, traitors and spies who are working for Moscow. So, the reason I mention this is because the American president gets a great degree of decisional latitude compared to other leaders of other governments in other countries because of the nature of the American political system. America is a nation state. So we talked about oh, by the way, here's again the picture of how somebody who perceives complexity in why Beijing today is acting the way it does in its foreign policy in the South China Sea and elsewhere, or why Russia acts the way it does. They see complexity in that foreign policymaking process of that country. And somebody who sees complexity doesn't talk about good versus evil. They talk about a number of different component interests, economic interests, security interests, pride, history of humiliation in the case of China, Communist Party interests, economic interests, military interests, police interests, personal interests, and that Xi Jinping has got to coordinate all of these competing and conflicting interests. They're involved, immersed in making decisions. Policymakers rely upon what already exists. There is these vast bureaucracies, these foreign policy organizations that implement the security interests, the economic interests of a country internationally, the security interests of a country internationally, the intelligence interests of a country internationally, the propaganda interests of a country internationally, the agricultural interests of a country. Every government agency has an international component these days in the era of globalization, right? And so, and how does a country decide what its foreign policy is? It builds on what already exists and makes small incremental changes in those existing policies, because you have to use and you respond to the political pressures and interests that have been built up over many years, involving thousands and thousands, if not more, of people who are also political players in your country's politics. And so decisional style or target is incremental, with decision makers immersed in details. And somebody who also sees complexity understands the power capabilities of a country, not in terms of them being a slave empire, the way Mordor in the Soviet in the Lord of the Rings is powerful because orcs are vast slaves, will do anything what you tell them and they'll fear death. No, of course not. There's issues of politics, about legitimacy, about the stability of the government, about, of course, the hard power elements, also about the economic development of the country, and so on. And we'll disagree about why China is belligerent in the South China Sea. We'll disagree about why China is building artificial military bases on artificial islands in the South China Sea. But I understand that you disagree with me, not because you're evil or not because you're a fool, but because we have legitimate different understandings of the evidence, right? But somebody who is portraying that China's the new Soviet Union, China wants to establish a world hegemony, China wants to make itself the new middle kingdom of human race. This is a demagogue, all right? This is somebody who's advancing a stereotypical view to appeal to people within the country in order to win political votes, like Donald Trump. China, 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 right? So, and this is another way of understanding, again, complexity. But when you look at the United States control system, right? You look at the United States, what kind of political system it had in place in the United States. It was a different kind of political system that we saw in the Soviet Union, for example. Let me see if I can find. I thought I had that set up here. Just a second. I mean, the American president has a great degree of freedom of maneuver in his policies because of the nature of the political system in which the United States, these are the elements of power in international relations. A country's got a big resource base. Of course, it's, capital and industrial base, its size of its population, how educated its people are, but also the elements of mobilization base. How nationalistic is the community of people? Do they feel pride in their country? You might feel pride in China, but how many people feel tremendous pride in the Democratic Republic of Congo, this multi-ethnic state with arbitrary borders drawn by the Belgians and the Germans, or Nigeria? How motivated are Nigerian people for Nigeria? Nigeria never existed until the British created it. Or let's take a case relevant to Asia. How proud and how mobilizable are the people of India? India is a country that was created by the British. Now, Hindu nationalists claim, well, yeah, but India is also the homeland of Hindu culture. And the Hindu nationalists are playing with that. But there's a big section of the Indian society that's not Hindu. What, 15% of the population is Muslim. And then even Hindu nationalism has problems within it because of its caste system. I mean, the untouchables or the Dalit caste, they're considered to be the lowest of the low in that society. how can Hindu nationalism appeal to them if you belong to the Dalits? So China is a nation state. India is not a nation state. United States is a nation state. India is not a nation state. Russia is a nation state. India is not a nation state. And that makes a difference in terms of mobilization base. Can you get your people excited about foreign affairs? For the glory of China, by the glory of Chinese arms and weapons. I mean, the Indian military is 1/5 the size, budget is 1/5 the size of the Chinese budget. Can Narendra Modi get Indians mobilized to make more sacrifices to spend more money on their Indian military to deal with the Chinese threat? Will they make those sacrifices rather than allow them to have more prosperity in terms of apartments and cars and quality of life? And so national morale is what we're talking about. Morgenthau talks about national morale. But I want to talk about the nature of the control system in the United States, right? This notion of control system is taken from a man named Amitai Etzioni. And Amitai Etzioni, he's still alive. He's like 100 years old. And he studied control and complex organizations. And he was focusing upon business organizations. But that's what a state is. South Korea, United States, Belgium, these are all vast, complex organizations. That's all they are. They're vast, complex organizations. Some of these organizations people feel very emotionally about. Like I feel very strongly about the American state representing my nation through the government. The government of the United States of America represents the American nation, and the president of the United States is not just the chief executive officer. He is the living embodiment of America. He's the big daddy, the big aboji. He's the big papa. He's not just the chief executive. He's something more than that. He's emotional embodiment of American aspirations and hopes. And so he can become a controversial figure. So in the United States control system, in terms of how the authorities control the people, most people in America don't think that much about politics. So they habitually obey and don't even think about right and wrong. They just do what they know to be right or wrong. They don't even think about it. It's a habitual, it's unconscious obedience to society and the status quo of society, represented by your employer, by your teacher, by your professor, by your mayor, by your city council, by your governor, by your Congress, and by your president. You should obey them because they deserve to be in power. Why? Because they're in power. They're there. They should be obeyed because that's what we do. They weren't put there by Soviet Union. They weren't put there by Vladimir Putin. They weren't put there by Xi Jinping. Were not put in power by Adolf Hitler. They were not put in power by an invading force like the way the Americans put in power and invading their clients in Afghanistan. No. So normative habitual control is the most important element of the American control system. Also, the desire and belief that if you work hard in America, you will make economic and career progress. That belief that, this year I will live better than next year. And I can be ambitious and I will make money and I will have a nice life. And I'll buy a car and I'll get a house and I'll get a family and people respect me. Utilitarian control. And if I want to participate, I can participate in my church. I can participate even in politics. I can participate in professional political organizations. Not professional, I mean official political organizations like the local Democratic or Republican Party. But that's a very small section of the population that does that. And then coercion. People generally obey the rules because they think they should, and they don't really have to be controlled by fear. Like you do what the government wants you to do, or else they'll throw you in jail, and they'll torture you. Like in Stalin's Soviet Union, right? This was the control system in Stalin's Soviet Union in 1939. Coercion, fear, terror is the main method by which the Communist Party revolutionary changes the Soviet Union. Forcing all the farmers to give up their land, live on collective farms, taking all of their cows and pigs and land, using terror to control them, killing people, sending them to the concentration camps. And of course, in the terrible suffering, it's really hard to control people by promising them an economically better life. But you still need some people to obey because you need somebody to join the secret police in the party. So if you're a bright, ambitious person who's kind of embarrassed by how backward your country, Russia, is, but you want to be modern, and Joseph Stalin and the communists are offering you an opportunity to become modern and to attack everything that you think is in the way that makes you feel embarrassed about being Russian. Our backwardness, our stupidity, and so we're going to use the power of the state to control people in the name of scientific socialism, Marxism, Leninism, so progressive, so modern, so cutting edge. Of course, if you're a peasant, an illiterate peasant in Russia, that's not going to be very appealing. But if you're in the city and you go to college, you might find that appealing. And then, of course, we don't even know. I mean, you don't even know what you should do to avoid trouble in this revolutionary society. Normative habitual control is at the C level, the tertiary level of control, because this is revolution. You don't know what you need to do to avoid trouble. You don't know what the rules are. What should I do and not do in order to avoid trouble? You don't know to avoid trouble. And again, Marxism, Leninism symbols appeal to these people that join the police and the party and the new governing apparatus. But for the mass of the population, this isn't going to be very appealing to people who can't read and write.
Professor?
Yeah.
Professor, I think you're sharing other screen.
Well, yeah, it says I'm sharing screen. Okay, I guess I'll do it again. I got to remember it doesn't really. Oh, thank you for telling me. I mean, you didn't see this when I was talking?
Yeah, it was other.
Oh,
slide.
darn it. Yeah, it says you are screen sharing, So I was talking about the control system in the United States. Did you see this? Damn it. Normative habitual control, utilitarian control, coercion. But during times of crisis, the United States president can, after the 9/11 attacks, thank you for telling me what was going on. After the 9/11 attacks, for example, George W. Bush became really popular in America as he rallied the United States in the rally around the flag phenomenon to go to war against Iraq. But what did Iraq have to do with the September 11, 2001 attacks? Oh, he's involved. Saddam Hussein, he's going to make nuclear weapons and give them to terrorists. So we have to invade. And of course, we'll invade Afghanistan too. So they invaded Afghanistan, and George W. Bush became incredibly popular. Over 90% public opinion approval ratings. This is the rally around the flag phenomenon in which the American president is able to mobilize the people in this normative, habitual, utilitarian, traditional society in modern times. That's a legitimate political regime. But in Stalin's Soviet Union, you had something like this. Coercion, this is 1939, right? Before the war started, on the eve of World War II. Coercion, revolutionary change, joining the party. If your utilitarian participation needs, you want a career, you're ambitious, you're smart, you have a college degree, or you want to have social mobility, you might be attracted to the Communist Party. But the vast majority of the population, they're illiterate peasants. They're not going to understand Marxism, Leninism. And this is a revolutionary regime, normative habitual control. This is the kind of regime that characterizes more like North Korea, more like Saddam Hussein's Iraq. All right. And then compare with Nazi Germany's regime on the eve of World War II. This was an authoritarian populist regime. I mean, the majority of the population loved Adolf Hitler. They loved his brutish, lowbrow appeals to base German traditional symbols and nationalism, with their clownish behavior, with their people dressed up like Teutonic knights and marches with their Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. If you're a member of the elite, you might find that to be kind of ridiculous. But if you're a member of the majority of the population, yes, I again feel proud to be German after the humiliation of losing World War I and then losing all of our resources in the great inflation in the 1920s and then losing my job. Hitler makes me feel good to be German again. And if he had bothered to have an election, he would have won on a landslide. But there's a large minority of the population that hates this regime, that it's ridiculous, it's disgusting, it's dangerous. And these people are controlled through terror. And if you're an ambitious person who doesn't care too much about liberalism and democracy, you might join the Nazi party. You might join the Gestapo. You might join the SS. You certainly have to join the Nazi party if you hope to rise high in this political system. You have to join the party, right? And then this is a revolutionary society, right? This is a revolutionary society, so you don't really know, this is a revolutionary regime, so you don't really know what rules you need to follow to avoid trouble. So Adolf Hitler had tremendous decisional latitude. Even he was limited in what he could do, but not as much, say, as an American president is. But still, even an American president, because of the nature of the political regime, an American president has a lot more, I think, decisional latitude than, say, a German chancellor does, or Moon Jae-in does, the president of South Korea, or a Belgian prime minister does. An American president has great decisional latitude, particularly during times of crisis. And this is highlighted in terms of what we see in the behavior of nation states like the United States, like China, like Russia, like Japan. You know, we talked about this earlier, that they tend to be more likely to engage in stereotyping, to see diabolical enemies or degenerate targets for opportunity to expand, the way Hitler saw a wonderful opportunity to conquer Europe because everybody else was a sissy, weak, disorganized, degenerate. And to expand influence that for the sake of expanding influence for that state, because the state in the form of the government represents my nation, China, Russia, Japan. But what's Nigeria? Do I get excited about expanding the influence of the Nigerian state? It's not a nation state. It's a multi-ethnic post-colonial state. Nationalistic behavior. We already talked about this earlier. They'll be more focused upon bringing Taiwan back into China, or reuniting North and South Korea, because South Korea is not a nation state, but a reunited Korea would be a nation state. The people of nation states will display a greater concern with maintaining face and dignity in terms of how the representatives of the nation in the form of the government apparatus, like the military or the politicians, how they are treated and how they are dealt with. And for example, this is a concern because the Americans look really bad in Afghanistan. I mean, it's humiliating. You're there for 20 years, spend all that money, cause all that suffering and death, lose all those soldiers, and then when you declare you're leaving in 11 days, the government disappears. Poof! And Americans are going, it's not just the government's humiliated. Americans, particularly the elite who pays attention to politics, feel humiliated. And you see it now. When you read the New York Times, the fighting among the elite, and of course the politicians trying to win elections. Joe Biden is incompetent. Joe Biden is a disaster. Oh my God, we're so angry. If I am trying to win the elections for the Republican Party next year, and then the American presidential elections in 2024. And Joe Biden might well be, therefore, more motivated, I've been arguing, to maybe recognize Taiwan as a compensation, right? To somehow do something to make Americans feel good about America in the world by finally recognizing that Taiwan is a true democracy that needs to be defended and China bad. I mean, it's interesting when you read the New York Times newspaper, how there was an article, I can show it to you at some point, how the Chinese ambassador in the New York Times was writing about how he's sort of laughing at America. He doesn't come out and do that, but they're sort of crowing about, you lost. And if you're an American nationalist, as the typical citizen is, this is going to make you angry, right? The public of a nation state will show a greater likelihood to be susceptible to grandeur interests. So, like, for example, what's an example of that? When the Americans were humiliated in 1982, when the Lebanese militants, Arab nationalists, expelled the Americans by bombing their military barracks in 1982 in Beirut, in Lebanon, killed like 276 American Marines, and the Americans fled. The Americans 2 days later invaded Grenada and ousted the pro-Soviet regime, pro-Cuban regime in power in Grenada in 1982. I think it was 82, 83, under Ronald Reagan. That's an example of a grandeur interest. And so, yeah, in order to enhance the power of the state, there will be more effective appeals by state leaders to the citizenry to make sacrifices, right? To make, send your son or daughter or your brother or husband to join the military and pay more money to build a big, strong military rather than keep that money for yourself. And the military will be willing to fight. And then the commitment of the military to the defense of the state will be more intense. And then this is an important point. We talk about decisional latitude. The citizenry of a nation state will demonstrate a greater likelihood to grant state leaders a greater decisional latitude in defending state interests. So George Bush decides we need to invade Afghanistan because that's where Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda are hiding, and they planned their attack on us from Afghanistan. And American people went, "Yay, let's invade Afghanistan!" And then George Bush said, "And we need to invade Iraq because Iraq is also part of the axis of evil, along with Kim Jong-il of North Korea and Robert Mugabe of Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and so we need to invade Iraq too." And the American people went, "Yes, let's invade Iraq." But then getting out, but the citizenry will show a lesser likelihood of granting them the decisional latitude to accept defeats or the loss of face. So it's a big question. How much is Joe Biden and the Biden administration politically going to pay in the next elections for this humiliation? When, of course, the Republicans are going to always, the political opposition in the United States is going to continue to focus on this. It's a disaster. There are Americans still in Afghanistan. They're trapped there. You didn't plan this. It's a disaster. It's a humiliation. Or will Americans forget about it? So, that's the context for understanding the discussion this week in the chapter about the American presidential power. You can't understand public opinion unless you understand nationalism. You cannot understand public opinion and therefore how American presidents and governments act in both domestic and foreign policy unless you understand nationalism. And it's a difficult topic to focus on because it's a very emotional, identity-based issue, and people are not consistent in their attitudes. So, for example, what's another example of a humiliation? Open up, make sure I share the right screen here. No, that's not the right one. Let me close that one. Okay, so let me make sure I'm sharing the right screen. So you saw it, for example, in Vietnam. The Americans got involved in Vietnam because they thought, again, the way like Eisenhower was speaking, that the trouble in Vietnam was caused by the Soviet Union. So we have to fight in Vietnam for the same reason we fought in South Korea, defense. This is 1964. This is after Kennedy's dead, and Lyndon Johnson is his president. He's not president because Kennedy's dead. Lyndon Johnson replaces him, and he sees an enemy, a diabolical communist movement directed by the Soviet Union. And then military vested interests are building up. Then at T2, the war continues on. The American presidents are telling the American people, the American generals are telling the American people, we're going to win. We're going to get rid of these agents and spies working for Moscow. We're going to inject our money. We're going to help develop South Vietnam. And we're going to get rid of these troublemakers in Vietnam. And the war continues in 1967. The war is not ending. Americans are being drafted to fight in this war, but the war is not ending. Even though the Americans are killing a lot of Vietnamese, they have tremendous firepower. They have the best military in the world. They're killing tens of thousands of Vietnamese, and they're not winning the war. The war is not stopping. Meanwhile, the Americans are also fighting and dying. So defense is still most important, but now you have these military vested interests, these economic vested interests, and these bureaucratic vested interests in the US government. as a result of all the money being invested in fighting the Vietnam War. And this is the military industrial complex. Remember, there's all these people in the military, outside the military, in the government, people in the corporations supplying the military who are getting promotions and getting jobs to contain communism in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, particularly in Vietnam. And people tend to see a world in a way that's self-serving. So of course, if my career and my paycheck and my salary depends upon fighting and winning the war in Vietnam, I'm going to keep telling you that we're fighting and winning the war because I really want to believe that. And I want you to believe that. Because it's my career and it's who I am. And then grandeur begins to emerge that we got to win this war. You know, we have all of these soldiers fighting and getting killed and killing other people. We can't admit that's a mistake. We've got to make the Vietnamese submit to our will. We must make North Vietnam submit. And this is pride. And the importance of national pride and US motivation was never captured from public opinion surveys, which rather indicated confusion on the part of the public. So you ask one public opinion survey, and one public opinion survey, the American people say, yeah, we need to get out of Vietnam. And then another public opinion survey, based upon how the words are expressed, say we should destroy North Vietnam with everything we've got, turn it into a parking lot. So the American people themselves don't know what they want. And so, yeah, you see public opinion surveys today about how the American people support Biden's getting out of Vietnam. I'm out of Afghanistan, sorry. Yeah, we need to get out of Afghanistan, but at the same time, they don't like their nation looking like it's foolish. You spend 20 years in Afghanistan, and then when you announce you're leaving, 11 days later, the government falls. And the Taliban that you've been fighting and killing Americans for 20 years is now all of a sudden back in power. After hundreds of billions of dollars, many hundreds of billions of dollars, 2,500 dead Americans, tens of thousands wounded, and God knows how many hundreds of thousands of Afghanistan people. And the Islamists and the Arab nationalists going, ah, and the Chinese going, ah, and the Russians going, ah. So by 1968, the Tet Offensive happens, in which the American government and the generals are telling, and the president is, we're going to win, we're going to win, we're going to win, and they don't win. And vested interests are becoming dominant and motivating this war. Defense becomes secondary. At this point, Lyndon Johnson, the president of the United States, is actually on the phone talking to the Mao Zedong Leonid Brezhnev in Moscow, saying, you know, you should help us here in this war in Vietnam, because, you know, if we lose, the Chinese are going to take over. We originally got involved in Vietnam to contain the Soviet Union. Even before Lyndon Johnson leaves office in 1968, he's on the phone with the Soviet leadership trying to get them to help us win the war in Vietnam. And then when Nixon is back in power in 1970, it's all about grandeur. The peace with honor. We must not look like we were humiliated. We must look like we were not defeated. That becomes the driving motivation. So this is the context, the historical analogies to try to understand what's now going to happen today in 2021, 1 month after the Taliban came into power in Kabul. What is going to happen elsewhere? And how is Joe Biden, the president, going to deal with American nationalism, American pride? And my concern is it's going to be reflected in Taiwan. They're going to compensate by moving towards reestablishing formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan as a separate country. And there's lots of evidence of that. I mean, when you look, for example, in the, let me see if I can open something up here to show you what I mean. This is from yesterday. I found this, the Taipei Times. Taiwan is really pushing hard to get the Americans to recognize them. So please respond to the following statement. The US, let me make a break there. You can see that, I think. The Biden administration will allow Taipei to rename the Thai Economic and Cultural Representative Office to the Taiwan Representative Office. So right now, the Representative Office of Taiwan in the United States is officially the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office. This is the name of the capital of Taiwan, right? Taipei. And we already covered, like in the European Union member state Lithuania has already made this recommendation, has already made this agreement that they're going to allow Taipei Representative Office to call itself the Taiwan Representative Office. And Beijing is furious about what Lithuania has done, one of the 27 member states of the European Union. And it states here, the day after the phone call, what's this phone call? Yeah, US President Joe Biden talked with President Xi Jinping of China. They talked on the phone last week. This is just from last week. They talked on the phone. They said both have a responsibility to manage their affairs and manage their disagreements. The day after the phone call between Biden and Xi, the Financial Times, the British newspaper, reported that Washington was considering a request from Taiwan to rename the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office to the Taiwan Representative Office. So I keep coming across this discussion. It goes on here at about the same time as reported by the Financial Times. Financial Supervisory Commission Chairman Wellington Koo and Minister of Foreign Affairs Joseph Wu were engaged in talks with Washington over the renaming of Taiwan's diplomatic mission in the United States. So of course, China insists that America agreed there's only one China. Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan is not a sovereign state. United States will not recognize Taiwan as a new country. It will and Taiwan will reunify with the mainland. That was the agreement 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 45 years ago under Jimmy Carter. And China is making military threats. It's mobilizing its air force. It's indicating to the European Union, NATO, and the United States that it will not tolerate the US and its allies recognizing Taiwan as a sovereign member state of the world, the way South Korea, United States, Belgium, Kyrgyzstan, Ukraine are all part of the 200 or so states of the world. So please respond to the following statement. US Biden administration will allow Taipei to rename the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in Washington to be called the Taiwan Representative Office. So let me go back to the class and assign you to breakout rooms and put you into 3 different groups. Assign automatically. Go. Please join the rooms. Please join your room, 1, 2, or 3. And there's no right or wrong answer here. I just want to get us talking about American politics and American nationalism because, like I said, you cannot understand public opinion, and therefore you can't understand politician behavior, American government official behavior, unless you understand American nationalism. So who's going to speak for these groups? And I'll flip a coin, and heads will be from the top of the group, and it's heads. So that means Ido He will speak for room 1, Anais will speak first for room 2, and Elisa will speak first for room 3. So you are the chair of each group and decide where your group fits on this scale. Do you think the US will eventually recognize Taiwan as Taiwan, no longer as Taipei? So do you strongly agree, can't decide, disagree, strongly disagree? And maybe I'll flip a coin. Heads on 1, 2, 3. And it's heads. So heads, I'm 1. And it's tails. Heads, I'm 2. I'm 3. I'm neutral. Cannot decide. So I will write a statement about being neutral or can't deciding. And on a dry piece of paper here. This is hard for me to do because I think they're more likely to do it than not. But okay, yeah, again, one of the reasons I like doing these exercises is because it makes me think through my own thoughts. Oh, yeah. And I think you Koreans might have an idea of what I'm going to get to here. Oh, man. Ooh. It's a good test. It's a good test. Okay, like I said, there's no right or wrong answer. I just want us to get us talking here. And so let me go back to the breakout rooms. "20 seconds. I've got to make sure I remember to do attendance. So let me do that while you're getting set up here. And attendance. And your attendance number is 980, 980. So let me put that in the chat. Okay, so who's going to speak first? Heads is room 1, and it's tails. Heads is room 2, and it's tails. So Alisa, where did your group decide to place itself on the scale?
we said we agree with the statement because, like you already explained, they shifted their attention to Taiwan after Afghanistan. But then also, my teammate said that the US has already started exporting weapons to Taiwan as well.
Oh,
So
they've done that for decades. I mean, under Jimmy Carter, I mean, they always agreed that they would sell weapons to Taiwan. And that always irritates the Chinese, but they've been doing that for 40 years.
Okay.
Right? Supposedly, the Chinese complain, and the Americans don't sell them the most advanced weapons. But now there's the talk about the Americans might sell them, like they never sell them the F-35 stealth fighters that they're selling to South Korea, the most recent American stealth fighter. That might be one thing they could do. Start selling the stealth fighters to Taiwan and sell them, not give them, sell them. They'll make money. And the Chinese would be furious, but the Americans have never sold that. But that might be one way by which they might change without changing the status quo. What else do you have to add? Anything else?
No, we had that as main point.
Okay.
So,
that might be one thing. You see that the Americans start selling the latest technology, like the F-35 stealth fighter that I think they agreed to sell also to South Korea. Okay, so let me go back to the breakout room to find out who's next. And heads is room 2, and it is heads. So Anais, what did your group decide in terms of where you fit on the scale?
Yes, we chose to agree because, as one of my teammates mentioned, America is having conflict with China. So to recognize Taiwan, it would mean that it would weaken China.
Okay, I mean, anybody else? What else in your group do you have? Both of you have stated agree, both room 1 and 2. Oh, no, sorry, group 2 and 3 have both stated agree. Anybody else in group 2 or 3 have more explanation as to why you agree? In terms of Chun Hyo-kyung or Eugene Kim or Kim Jae-hwan, do you have something to add?
I have something to add. We also talked about the U.S. shifted the Pacific Alliance to it's not Pacific, Atlantic Alliance to Pacific Alliance, just like AUKUS, which is
what?
Or AUKUS. It's
AUKUS, Australia,
AUKUS.
US, whatever they're calling it, the Australia, US, UK, US alliance, yeah.
Yeah, so
AUKUS.
So we thought US wanted to make alliance with the Taiwan also.
Okay. China's a big, powerful country, though. I mean, okay, you guys could, I said, though, however, they might do something, as we talked about earlier, about in the nuclear setting, since 1945, great powers compete more and more indirectly with each other. So Lithuania, 2 months ago, decided to allow Taiwan to call its office the Office of Taiwan, no longer Taipei office. Little Lithuania, that sells that beer in 7-Eleven. That little country, they would not have done that unless they had backup from NATO and the United States and the European Union. Particularly since they have a problem with Russia, and Russia is China's ally. So they want America to become more actively involved in confronting China and US and China and Russia, because that helps Lithuania. Because they're on the front line with Russia, and Russia's a problem. So they've already done it. And, and they're in the Eurozone as well. So anybody else from room 1 or 2 or 3 want to chip in? If not, we'll go to room 1. Lee Do-hee, what did your group decide? Or what did your group decide in terms of where you fit on this scale? Lee Do-hee.
Yes, our group also agreed about this sentence about that. We think that the US want to keep the Chinese force to allow the Taipei to rename. So I think I also strongly agree about this.
You strongly agree. Again, let me tell you what I wrote. and I didn't really think through this until I wrote it down. And I was flipped a coin and I had to be neutral, cannot decide. So I am neutral because China has tremendous bargaining leverage. So remember we talked about bargaining leverage, and let me open up that bargaining leverage. Is that it? Bargaining leverage, where's the bargaining leverage? I'm looking for the bargaining leverage file that I showed you before. And maybe this is it. No, just a second. I want to find that bargaining leverage file that I showed you before. Yeah, I'm surprised. Okay, here it is. So, screen share, and here is the bargaining leverage list. I hope you can see that. Yeah, it says participants can now see application. So, perceived ability to influence third countries. Perceived likelihood of accidental war. I mean, all of these levers are tied together. And you see mobilization base here, as part of power. I mean, this whole framework is trying to understand power in terms of diplomacy and how power means leverage, bargaining leverage and diplomacy. So these levers all interact with each other, but we have to split them apart to talk about them. So what did I say? I am neutral because China has tremendous bargaining leverage, which will prevent the US from changing the political situation, the status quo. China will if the US does recognize Taiwan, China will likely respond by recognizing Palestine, for one, because that will irritate the Americans and encourage Arab nationalists to be favorable to China. Of course, the US might try to punish China economically. That's the always concern, right? That US has an advantage here in terms of China still needs to export its products in order to continue to develop, right? And the American government would love to have an excuse to put more restrictions on Chinese imports from China, right? But they could recognize Palestine, or they could also more closely support Iran, but that'll also infuriate America and its alliance with Israel. So that might be direct, but what they could do is China will no longer work to enforce sanctions on North Korea. If the Americans move towards increasing their recognition of Taiwan, the Chinese will move to remove their barriers or their trade sanctions on North Korea. And North Korea will therefore continue to build more nuclear weapons and more missiles. If the US moves to change the status quo over Taiwan, it means that China is going to become much more supportive of North Korea. And this is why North Korea wants nuclear weapons. Not because they actually want to nuke the United States or attack South Korea, but because accidents happen. And if North Korea has more and more nuclear weapons and a conflict emerges or happens, or maybe they might even start one, they might sink another South Korean Navy vessel like the Chonan, like they did 10 years ago, and deny that they did it and cause a crisis. But now North Korea has 100 nuclear weapons. Is South Korea going to strike back? Are the Americans going to strike back? What's going to happen? Now you got North Korea with 100 nuclear weapons, let's say, instead of just 30 or 40 that they have now. So I think that's the big, one of the big cards up China's, one of the big bargaining levers that China has, that if the United States changes the status quo in the Pacific by recognizing Taiwan, that means China is going to become completely unsupportive in American policy towards North Korea. Because right now the Chinese are enforcing sanctions, but they won't necessarily remove the sanctions, but they won't enforce them anymore. And that will cause trouble, of course, with South Korea and of course, so there will be a cost. China can make a cost to the United States for doing this. if it recognizes Taiwan in a way that's deniable. They can somehow claim that they're not doing anything assertively by just basically de facto removing any kind of sanctions on North Korea, economic sanctions on North Korea. And the Americans know this, or they should know it. So, I mean, that's something, I mean, that's the nice thing about having a good theoretical framework. It helps teach you, it helps teach me, it helps guide our thinking. And it tells us that if the US recognizes Taiwan, it's going to really impact South Korea's situation, because how China will retaliate or respond in terms of the North Korean nuclear program and North Korean situation. So let's do a vote then on that topic to wrap it up. And so do you think that the Biden administration will eventually allow Taipei to rename the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office to the Taiwan Representative Office? So please vote, and you have 30 seconds. I'm using my watch to. Of course, the advocates of a strong, assertive US foreign policy might say something along the lines of, well, China's not really doing enough against North Korea anyway. The North Korean regime would have fallen a long time ago without Chinese support, supposedly. So it looks like, well, six of you agree, 7 agree. Nobody disagrees. No, one person disagrees. Okay. So let's do another exercise to get us talking about the notes for this week. And close that and go back to foreign policy. So my question to you is, does the US Trump administration, which is no longer in power, of course, does it continue to weaken US power and influence today, 9 months after the Trump administration left office? So let me go back and recreate the breakout rooms. And I want to change, well, I guess you're going to keep them there. And this time it will be, see, the second person from the bottom. So heads is middle, and it's heads, it's tails. So the bottom person, so Nikita, Chung Hyo Kyung, and Kim Jae Hwan will speak. And so please rejoin your rooms and tell me if you think, what do you think, how do you respond to this statement that 9 months after the Trump administration left office in January of this year, the US is weaker today because of the Trump administration. It's less influential, has less diplomatic bargaining leverage today because of the Trump administration. And explain why. And I forgot to share the screen there. Share screen. Okay, and so again, I am, you can see that, I think, right? I am heads 1, 2, or 3, and I'm heads. And heads, I'm a 1, and it's tails. Heads, I'm a 2, and it's heads. So I agree that the Trump administration continues to weaken US power and influence today, 9 months after it left office. So I agree. Because 1, and I tell you, let me show you how I'm answering this question by going back here. I think you can see that. Did I open the rooms? I think I opened the rooms, didn't I? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Like I said, there's no right or wrong answer here. Okay, so let me go back to the breakout rooms. Thirty seconds. Five seconds. Okay, so who's going to speak first? And heads, it is room 1. And it's tails. So heads, it's room 2. And it's heads. So it's room 3. No, it's room 2. Sorry, room 2. So room 2, and that is Chun Hyo-kyung. What did your group decide as to where it fits on this scale?
Yeah, we agree to the question,
And so why?
and it's because the Biden administration's trade policy after taking office in the world, it can be said to be Trump-free Trumpism. Although the policy is differentiated from the Trump administration in maybe human rights, democracy, and others have been proposed. The Biden administration maintains America first in trade and China, and it's still going on. The Trump administration, it's affecting the Biden, and also the world is naming him unsuccessful president, and he is irresponsible about his work and lack with the result. That's we talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, it's very difficult for Biden to undo what the Trump administration has done, because he'll be subject to charges of being not defending American interests. That Trump was America first. Trump was standing up against exploitation. If Biden immediately reverses all of the trade tariff placements of the Trump administration on China and other countries, he will be opening up himself to charges, political charges from the Republican Party that is dominated by Trump, that Trump still dominates, that he is a globalist, that he's not concerned about America's well-being. So he's politically constrained by that militant nationalist Trump experience. Still to this day is constraining the president. He doesn't politically have the decisional latitude right now to just say, oh, I'm going to reverse everything that Trump decided. They're doing it slowly, like he's agreed to allow 120,000 refugees to claim asylum in the United States, down from like 10,000 that the Trump administration reduced the number to, from I think it was like 120,000 under Obama. 120,000 refugees a month could claim asylum in the United States under Obama, and then the Trump administration reduced it to like 10,000, almost none a year. And he announced they're going back up to 120,000, but that's politically sensitive because of American nationalism, right? And that was what Trump was claiming, that the Democrats, they're globalists, they care about the well-being of everybody else rather than America first, and they want to allow everybody who's poor to come into America, and to sell their products. And so for Biden simply can't reverse all of that, which makes America's leadership position in the institutions in trade and international refugees and migration policy that America helped create after World War II much more difficult because of American nationalism. Okay, and do you have any else? Who else is in that group? So we have Eugene Kim or Anaïs, do you have anything else to add? If not, I will now, heads is room 1. And it's heads. So Nikita, where does your group fit on this scale?
Yes, we also think, we also had the argument about the trade and America First policy, but I think you have to look at it like Trump made promises, and it would have been bad for Biden to then, when he got elected, drop all the promises immediately. Yeah, I mean, they have, like, for example, removed some tariffs from European imports. That was another Trump Biden administration move. You know, on wine, and there was some decision to mutually remove tariffs on Boeing and Airbus products, but they haven't removed the tariffs on Chinese imports yet. What else I'm sorry, I interrupted you. What else do you have to add? Yeah, but I think that's the main argument. Like all the things that Trump has promised or has done, it would look bad, yeah, for Biden to then immediately, like maybe in the long run, like after some time has gone by, he could start changing things on his own opinion or decision. But right now, I think it's still tarnishing the influence of America, yeah, from the Trump administration. Okay, yeah. Anybody else in that group? Let's see, who else is in that group? That is Gilles or Dohi. Anybody else have anything to add? If not now, maybe later. Kim Jae.
Now.
Okay, Kim Chae-hwan, where does your group fit on this scale? Kim Chae-hwan. Oh, I think somebody says she got a microphone problem. She writes, I am on the neutral side because although Trump administration did show some kind of selfish policies, but it is hard to say that the impact of this administration has been continued until now, since Biden is quite on the different side from Trump. Maybe he could recover the weakened power of the U.S. Maybe. Let me tell you how I wrote agree, because one, the U.S. regime appears to be less stable. So to go back to that diagram showing bargaining leverage, and make sure, I got to make sure that you can see this. So go here and bargaining lever. You see this reference to perceived stability of the political regime, perceived ability to deal with domestic political dissatisfaction, and perceived economic or political stability. This is one of the effects of the Trump experience is this. You don't know if Biden is going to, if the Republicans are to come back into office, right? Because of the Trump administration, the US regime appears less stable, so its political commitments to its alliances appear less stable. The Trump administration was a radical departure from previous administrations. Trump still dominates the Republican Party. And the party is now Trumpist. The Republican Party is now Trumpist, and it may well take control of one or both houses of the US Congress in the next elections next year. The Democrats only have a 3-vote majority in the House of Representatives, and they have a 1-vote majority in the Senate. So if you're the German government or the Belgian government or the Chinese government, the Biden administration might make promises, but you don't know what's going to happen in the US in terms of what happens if the Republicans take control of the Congress. Not to mention what might happen in 2024. I mean, usually US voters reelect their presidents, but still the Republicans will dominate the Congress, and they're going to continue to refuse to promote, for example, trade liberalization, or approving joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or a new trade liberalization regime with Western Europe, with Europe. There was talk about a transatlantic trade and investment agreement, sort of like a Trans-Pacific Partnership, but for the Western world, for US and Europe. There won't be any movement on that. Or climate change. Will the Republicans agree? That's why they're pointing out that what happens in the next couple of weeks is going to be very important, not only for Americans, but for the whole world, because the Biden administration and the Democratic Party is trying to push through a major climate change program in legislation over the next couple of weeks, before the end of next month. And it will be important not only for Americans, but it'll be important in terms of signaling to the rest of the world, to Brussels, to Beijing, as to whether or not the United States is committed to working with them to resolve sustainable development, climate problems, issues, and I assume also, for example, other issues that confront the international community, like the long-term COVID-19 outlook. So, yeah, I'm sorry. This is what I meant to highlight, not this one. So that might be one way to understand the legacy of the Trump administration, because America looks different. America's changed. The government and its commitments do not look stable. And so America's bargaining leverage in negotiating with Brussels or Beijing or Moscow has decreased on these scales, on these levers. And if that was, there's been a lot of talk about how Vladimir Putin in Moscow encouraged the Russian secret police organizations to help Trump get elected through social media campaign. And if Putin's objective, if the Russian government objective was to weaken American influence in the world, that was a pretty significant step because it's made an impact. And so the passage of this legislation going through the Congress right now, while the Democrats continue to control the government, is important for a lot of reasons, including signaling to the world the strength of American commitments to them and to the rest of the world. So let me do another vote. And stop share. Here. And go back to vote. So please vote. The Trump administration continues to weaken US power and influence today, 9 months after it left office. And you have 30 seconds. Or I think that's just about everybody. I think there's only 8 students here today. Oh, 9 students. Okay. So the Biden administration, Joe Biden, president of the US, is continually saying America needs to pass this climate change legislation to provide, again, to support American leadership in the world. In other words, support America's bargaining leverage. I mean, it's almost like daily, the kind of rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration along those lines. Okay, so let's open the notes for Chapter 4, Presidential Power, and take a peek at those and make sure that you're able to see that. So we're going to share screen. Okay, so again, the textbook was written and published during the beginning of the Trump administration. So the impact of the Trump administration is not really covered in that book, not very much. So they make some statements that I hope are a little more fully understandable after what I presented here, the first half of the class. So it starts off by saying the US president is the most powerful individual in the world. Okay. Again, because of mobilization base. Remember we talked about mobilization base? Mobilization base. And the American president has that advantage in mobilization base because of he's a living symbol of the American nation state that translate into bargaining leverage. So back to the notes, and I have to redo the screen share. And the US president's influence over government policy is much greater in foreign policy than in domestic policy. But of course, domestic policy and foreign policy are becoming more and more intermixed, intermestic, international and domestic, intermestic. When we talk about climate change, right? We're talking about policies. Climate change policy has to address American domestic economic policy, and addressing domestic American economic policy to address global climate change, therefore impacts upon the US bargaining leverage of the Biden administration in the rest of the world. So yeah, this is true, but as a result of globalization, the separation between international and domestic policy is becoming less and less clear, more and more blurry. But the US president's influence over foreign policy has grown tremendously since the Second World War. And this is, of course, during the Cold War, as we talked about, in this class, the dominant view in Washington by the late 1940s, even before the Korean War began, was that the Soviet Union was a Russian version of Nazi Germany. That the Soviet Union was belligerent because it was trying to expand and dominate the world. You heard Dwight Eisenhower make those kinds of references. And so of course, the view of the Nazi Germany was that it's a brutal, thuggish military regime that prefers and only understands the threat and use of force. And so the United States has to develop its ability to threaten and use force to contain the Soviet Union, the Russian version of Nazi Germany. And if you contain it, let me go back to regime PowerPoint presentation that I showed you earlier that I think I closed, but I didn't mean to close it. But just a second. Okay, this kind of regime, let me make sure you can see that the belief was that the Soviet Union was a Russian version of Nazi Germany. So again, this was the control system in Nazi Germany. This is how the Nazis controlled the German people. And the point about this kind of control system, this is an authoritarian populist regime. This is a fascist regime. And US was moving in this direction under Trump. It wasn't there, but it was moving in this direction. That this kind of regime has to appeal to its people by promising them pride and glory for the nation, right? The normative active appeal in terms of manipulating symbols and appealing to people with the rhetoric of symbols, you're gonna have to appeal to those people's nationalism. They don't know about Marxism, Leninism. They don't care about Marxism, Leninism or capitalism, but they do love their country. And so you have to appeal to them and claim that you are ruling over them because you're going to make Germany great again, or make America great again, or make China great again. And making them great again includes providing the people, the public with glory, 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 international conquest, international victories. That's critically important for keeping this kind of regime in power, for this kind of ruling authority, like the Nazis or the Soviet Communist Party to stay in power. It had to expand. It had to give victory, glory, conquest to justify its brutal, harsh control over its people. So how do you change this threat? And how do you get rid of this threat? You have to successfully contain it, stop it from expanding. Because if they spend all those resources to try to expand and fail because you've contained them as the United States, the regime will become weaker and weaker and weaker because it must provide glory to its people through successful expansion to stay in power. That's why the US fought the war in Korea. That's why the US fought the war in Vietnam, to contain the Russian version of Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union. So, as I said, the prevailing view today in the United States is that it worked. Now, this is the evil empire. This is the diabolical enemy, right? And this diabolical enemy doesn't care about human life, is cynical and cruel. And that means we have the government in the United States, the authorities in the US government decided we had to give the American president the tools he needs to meet the Soviet threat anywhere in the world where it attempts to expand. So we have to centralize power in the United States, and the US president has to be able to act quickly and fast wherever the evil empire, the diabolical enemy, Mordor, attempts to expand through its evil plans and conspiracies and agents. And that made the US president, they gave this power and responsibility to the US president, and he still has it. Taking that power back, the Cold War has been over for 30 years, since 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. But the president still has all of those legal powers that built up during the Cold War. And presidents don't want to give that up. Even if you're Joe Biden, you don't want to become weaker. And so to support the president in meeting the threat from the evil empire, the US National Security Council was created in 1947 to centralize control over the US foreign policy to meet the perceived Soviet challenge during the start of the Cold War. And this was meant to advise the US president. And that meant that the it replaced the US State Department. The State Department is America's foreign ministry. You know, that's traditional diplomacy and negotiation, but Cold War militarized, securitized American foreign policy. That's why America has 800 or more military bases all over the planet, because of the Cold War, to contain the Russian version of Nazi Germany. And American presidents like to demonstrate that they're effective by using those tools that they got during the Cold War to appeal to their American public, to keep support, win elections. And they have a lot of tools, so they want to appear effective in foreign policy, because in foreign policy, American presidents are less limited in their decisional latitude by the Congress. The Congress gave the president all of this power during the Cold War. So American presidents, if they want to show I'm an effective leader, they will often be drawn to foreign affairs because it's easier, politically easier, or can be easier. So Biden is taking a hit with Afghanistan, because even if it couldn't have been done easily, his enemies, his adversaries are portraying that. Look at this clown. Look what he did in Afghanistan. So the US presidents consequently have freely utilized a variety of unilateral tools. That means they have tools in their own hands at their disposal that strengthen their ability to control US foreign policy. So US presidents try to show that they're great leaders to their people, and the people are nationalistic. So they want to believe that their leaders represent them, which means they want their leaders to look effective because of their nationalists. Hans Morgenthau was the first one to talk about this, right? In a systematic way, that American people, Russian people, Chinese people, Japanese people, they want their leaders to look like they're effective on world affairs because it makes them feel good about being Japanese or Chinese or Americans or Russians. Sometimes they use that influence effectively. Like, for example, Bill Clinton decided that he could use his powers to have the US approve the Chemical Weapons Convention to eliminate chemical weapons. US President George W. Bush on October 25th, 1991, issued a national security directive that defined blueprints for the US invasion of Afghanistan in response to the Taliban government's role in hosting Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, whom the US identified as the perpetrators of the 9/11/2001 attacks. By the way, I mean, it was the Trump administration that negotiated with the Taliban beginning in early last year to begin to leave Afghanistan without even talking to the Afghan government, the President Ghani government in Kabul. And the Trump administration agreed to leave Afghanistan by May 1. And the US couldn't leave by May 1, but Biden said that he wanted out by September 11, 2021. Not May 2021, September 11, 2021. And they left by the end of August. And then immediately as they left, Afghanistan regime collapsed. US President Barack Obama justified sending US military forces to Libya in March 2011 in the midst of uprisings against the Libyan government using a UN Security Council resolution without even asking the US Congress for support. The US Congress did not agree to have the US military bomb Libya in 10 years ago. US President Harry S. Truman did the same thing when he sent US forces to Korea in 1950, although later the US Congress would agree to it. But that was the first time the US government had done that it launched a major war without first getting approval from the US government, from the US Congress. Donald Trump, authorized using the biggest bomb available in the US military against the Islamic State in Afghanistan. Of course, the book was published before Donald Trump killed the second highest official in the Iranian government, Qasem Soleimani, in January 2020, January last year. He didn't ask the Congress to do that. He just decided that he needed to do that to protect and American soldiers in Iraq that were being attacked by Iran's allies in Iraq, supposedly, militia allies. And so he decided to kill Soleimani. And supposedly the Iranians have said, we're going to get back at you someday for that. You're going to pay for that. US presidents have less dominance over US foreign policy when the political opposition party controls one or both houses of the US Congress. So when another party controls the House or the Senate or both of US Congress, the US presidents are constrained in their foreign policy. But still, Trump still killed Qasem Soleimani, even though the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives, but they didn't control the Senate. The Senate was still under the Republican control at the time. So Dwight Eisenhower, you saw referenced at the beginning here, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, G.W. Bush have confronted Democratic Party controlled Congresses. So it says here, it goes on, US presidents must maneuver among multiple power centers within the executive branch of the US federal government. So presidents, as we see, even Donald Trump, there was limits to what he could do politically. I mean, he couldn't just fire everybody who was in his way, although he could try to fire them or push them out. He did terminate some people, but when the US generals refused or were or obstructed what he wanted to do, it was difficult for Donald Trump to override them. We see the judicial branch playing a more important role in foreign policy, particularly in regard to immigration policy. Again, international domestic policy is becoming more and more blurred and interwoven due to globalization, including the unpleasant sides of globalization, refugee movements. So with climate change and economic distress and the COVID-19 pandemic, there's big movement of populations, and the Trump administration and the Biden administration are subject to political pressure from American nationalists who are afraid of these foreigners coming into their country. And it's a nationalistic issue that they're always concerned will be used against them in the next elections by their adversaries. So that's why the Trump administration is having difficulty reversing the the Biden administration is having difficulty reversing the Trump administration's restriction on immigration in the United States. Big difficulty because of nationalism. But US presidents, they deal with multiple foreign leaders. They have hundreds of domestic and foreign policy special interest groups that they have to accommodate. They're all pursuing their own foreign policy agendas. And again, a president or a congressperson in US is always thinking about the impact of their actions on public opinion. What will be the impact on public opinion in the next elections? So the president is not Sauron. The president is not God. The president has to play politics, has to be involved in politics and negotiating and bargaining among these different groups, including the ministries, the departments of the US government, like the Homeland Security Department, the intelligence agencies, the Defense Department, the State Department, National Security Council, Congress, the Vice President, informal advisors, and then outside sources that are feeding into the government that are not part of the government, like universities, foreign governments, public opinion, businesses, the news media, think tanks, nonprofit interest groups, and intergovernmental organizations. So you have these vast vested interests that built up during the Cold War, and presidents and congressmen, congresspeople, senators, and other elected representatives are always thinking about, how can I win the next elections? And that means making sure you don't make lots of enemies, including cutting people's business that they're receiving as contractors for the Defense Department, for example. So the US president's political role in the foreign and domestic policymaking process in Washington is to use his or her power capabilities, including persuasive appeals directly to the American public, to convince the other senior players, like the other senators and politicians, that they should want what the president wants. And Biden is assuming that despite the fact that some Americans complain about too much American involvement around the world, they still want America to be playing an important role in world affairs, whether it be for economic and business interests, but also pride and standing up to communist China. I mean, that was a big focus of the Trump administration, that the Chinese Communist Party is a dangerous threat. And the Biden administration doesn't use the word Chinese Communist Party, but Biden very frequently is always comparing US position to China. China, China, China. And he's a Democrat. So the Constitution of the US government, co-determination of foreign and domestic policy by the legislative and executive branch of the US federal government is a principle that the founders of the US Constitution incorporated to block tyranny at home and adventurism abroad. So the people that wrote the US Constitution wanted the Congress to play an important role in shaping American foreign policy. But modern presidents are hesitant to let the US Congress determine what they will or will not do. So when the US Constitution was written, it wasn't clear what the power of the president would be. It did say in the US Constitution, the president was commander-in-chief of the military, that during wartime, the American president would lead the military. But that's pretty much it. 240 years later, you can see that the US president has very wide discretion or decisional latitude or prerogative powers in directing foreign affairs, compared to, say, for example, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor. And so the US president has this wide range of authority, both in day-to-day matters of running the government, as well as in crisis emergencies. And as the modern American nation state emerged, the president became more and more important in claiming leadership of the entire American nation. Rather than, think what a president does. A president is a presider. I mean, I preside, like the president was supposed to be, in 240 years ago, the idea was the president was more like the King of England at the time. And the King of England didn't dominate and control the government. The King of England presided over the government. The King of England still dominated foreign policy, like its colonial policy, but still the British Parliament determined taxation and allocation of money to the government. But the King of England presided. So the president was supposed to preside. But by the end of the 19th century, the Civil War is over, America's united, and you see the president becoming the leader of a nation state. The living, breathing symbol representing the nation to the people and to the rest of the world. And that means a lot of authority and power, particularly during crisis, like wartime. And the Cold War was one long crisis. So Articles 1 through 2 of the US Constitution, they define the powers of the president and the Congress. And Article 1, the first article of the US Constitution, starts with the power of the Congress. The people that wrote the Constitution expected the Congress to be the dominant government body. And the president does not control the Congress the way the British prime minister controls the parliament. No, the president presides. The president cannot force Congress to do anything. He can persuade it. He can mobilize American public opinion to pressure the congressmen who are always thinking about the next elections, but he can't control them. So in foreign policy, you have co-determination as a result of the separation of powers that does not exist, say, in the British system. The British system is not separation of powers. The British Prime Minister controls the House of Commons. The House of Commons, except in unusual circumstances, does what the British Prime Minister wants it to do. If he can't control the House of Commons, until recently, it meant that he had to resign. But again, things are becoming more complicated in Britain as well, as represented by Brexit. But how does the Congress have its input? Through committees. There's a committee for the defense, for military issues. There's a committee for foreign policy issues. There's a committee that's supposed to focus its attention on those different aspects of domestic and foreign policy, as well as the president's agencies and the like. The Congress is a big body of people, 435 members. For the 535 members, including the Senate. So they engage in deliberation, compromise, and debate. That's what they do. But the president is supposed to be able to act quickly, with speed, and of course, secrecy, because the communists or our enemies must not find out what we're doing. So the president has advantage of speed, control over information. The president decides on a policy, puts it in place. The Congress is slow. The president has war powers as commander-in-chief of the armed forces and the authority to repel attacks without having to wait for Congress to agree to go to war. The Congress has the power to declare war and authorize ongoing deployments. The Congress has not officially declared war since World War II. The Congress has authorized or agreed with the president to use force, for example, in Korea and every time since in other forms. We're not formally declaring war the way states used to do so hundreds of years ago. The Congress has tried to limit the ability of the president to use deadly military force after the humiliation and failure in Vietnam. So the US Congress passed the War Powers Resolution of 1973 to make the US president get Congress's approval for a long-term significant use of deadly US force. But the US government presidents have never agreed that the War Powers Resolution of 1973 is legal. It's not been challenged in the Supreme Court. No president has agreed that this War Powers Resolution of 1973 at the end of the Vietnam War is legal. But still, US presidents don't want to make an enemy of the US Congress if they can avoid it. The president is supposed to be in charge of diplomacy in terms of recognizing, conducting routine relations with foreign governments. So if the US government were to recognize Taiwan, it would be an act by the Biden administration. The Congress would not have to approve that. The Biden administration could simply do it. Not simply. There will be a response. There'll be political outcry. There'll be political debate. And Joe Biden's adversaries in the US Congress and the Republican Party will surely complain. But Joe Biden does not have to ask the Congress for approval for that if he decides to want to recognize Taiwan. Appointment powers. The president is supposed to appoint ambassadors and cabinet secretaries, like the Defense Department secretary or the Secretary of State. And then the Congress, particularly the Senate, is supposed to confirm those nominees. So typically they're supposed to give the president the benefit of the doubt to let the president choose whom he wants to be ambassador and cabinet secretary. if the Congress Senate does not approve, it's a big problem. So they, of course, should approve somebody, or they should nominate somebody. The president should nominate those individuals whom they believe that they can get approved by the Senate. Because it's humiliating and embarrassing to nominate somebody and the Senate refuse to approve them, to confirm them. The president negotiates and signs treaties. The Senate has to ratify the treaty. So the president negotiates and signs treaties, but if they're not ratified, they can be changed by the next president. A ratified treaty by the Senate can only be changed by the Senate or the US Congress changing it. So that's why it's important that a treaty be ratified by the Senate, because then it's much more difficult to leave it. I mean, the Paris Accords in 2015, they were not part of a treaty agreement by the US government. It was what Barack Obama agreed to, and then Donald Trump withdrew from, and now Biden went back to. Who knows what will happen if Biden leaves office? But if it were approved by the US Senate, that would increase the perceived commitment of the US by Brussels, Berlin, Beijing, all the other states in the international political system. Administrative powers, the president oversees the Defense Department, the Secretary of State, the State Department, and the bureaucracy and the staff. And the Congress oversees these executive branch activities by asking them to come, their leaders come and testify in front of the various committees and answer questions. And the Congress, of course, also is supposed to approve the allocation of money. If you're a bureaucracy, you cannot do anything unless you have money. And the Congress has the power of the purse. The purse is where you put your money, right? The power of the purse. Economic powers, again, the US government executive branch leads the economic organizations and agencies. And again, the Congress, however, has to approve trade agreements, far-reaching trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, if that's going to be negotiated, or the free trade agreement with South Korea. I think the Congress approved the FTA with South Korea. Special powers, the president can declare national emergencies and sign executive orders. If the president gets extreme, the US Congress can impeach the president, which means put the president on trial, and if found guilty in the Senate, remove him. And that's never happened. They've been impeached, they've been put on trial. Trump was put on trial twice, but the US Senate did not vote by the required 2/3 majority, so 67 votes to remove him from office. Richard Nixon resigned as president because he was going to be impeached and he knew he would be removed. So he resigned before he could even be put on trial in 1974. Okay, yeah, declaring war was supposed to be a power that the US Congress was supposed to have. But even then, the US has used force long before the Cold War without a formal declaration of war. But we'll have to stop there. Anybody have any questions, comments? If not, I think that's it for today. Okay? Bye.
Thank you.